Well, this is a video that I've wanted to do for a very long time, but it probably hasn't made much sense until now. I thought with the recent influx of new subscribers that I'd go over my motorcycle story, take a look at the motorcycles that I've owned and what's transpired in this almost 2-decade long journey. Sit down, grab a drink and relax. It's a long one, but let's take a trip down memory lane. Right, well, we're going way back to the first motorcycle that I ever rode. I was probably around 9 or 10 years old when I rode this bike, and it wasn't my one, or it wasn't owned by my family. It was actually a family friend's bike, and it's a Honda XR50. Don't know what year it was, but the bike didn't have a clutch. It was semi-automatic, 3 gears, and the second that I jumped onto this bike, I was hooked. I remember when I first got on it, my dad put it in second gear and I just putt around in second. I didn't know about changing gears. Second was quite mild, so it wasn't all janky like first gear was. But I started to get the hang of it, and Dad and the people on the sidelines were telling me, all right, switch up a gear, switch up a gear. And I remember I'm revving it and I'm kind of going around a bend, and with the throttle open, I just bang it up a gear, and the bike pretty much wheelies because I'm holding the throttle. And I have my first ever stack because I wheelied just into a massive pine tree, and I was still hooked after that. Now that I'd gotten a taste for bikes, I knew that I had to have one. And at the time, my dad had a Yamaha XT250, which is actually featured on the channel, but I was too young, too small. That bike was way too powerful for me to ride, so I needed something for myself. So in comes the first motorcycle that I ever owned. And I didn't purchase this one because I was 10, 11, but it was the first motorcycle for me, and it was a Yamaha PW80. This thing ripped compared to the XR50 that I'd ridden because it was a 2-stroke, more capacity, had a little bit of a power band, but it was so much fun. It was still semi-automatic, so I hadn't ridden a clutch up until this point. But what I would do is pretty much every single weekend, I'd be ripping up and down the driveway. We were pretty lucky that we lived on a larger property, so any chance I could, I would just be ripping on this bike for hours and hours. So I do feel a little bit sorry for the neighbors because it wasn't that big of a property. My brother, who's a little bit younger than me, also got a PW80 at the time. So yeah, both of us would be ripping it up and down. And our neighbor's house actually backed onto a paddock, and we'd always, when we could, we'd go through his property and then into the paddocks where you could just go up and down, and it was just an open area so you could really ring out the bike. And back in those days, no one cared, no police would come and hassle you, so it was a really, really fun pastime was ripping it up in the paddocks. And at that time, the neighbors that I mentioned, they also had bikes and we'd ride together. Their bikes were a little bit bigger, but at different times they had smaller capacity bikes like the CRF 80. Another neighbor had a KTM 125, and I managed to get my hands on them at different points as I was growing up and start to learn how to ride with a clutch. But as I went into high school, I didn't really ride too much. I started focusing on the studies, and I kind of outgrew the PW80 given, it's still an 80cc bike. It was quite small, and I could only really ride it on the property, which over time kind of got a little bit boring. So it wasn't until 18 that I got back into it. So at 18, I got my learner's permit alongside my best friend Harrison, who has also featured on the channel, especially in some recent videos. But we both went and got our learners, but not so that we could ride on the road. Here in Victoria, you need a learner's permit or a motorcycle license to even ride on tracks that aren't private property. So we both went and got our learners, and then got our first trail bikes, or proper trail bikes. So for me, it was the KLX 300, the Kawasaki KLX 300, which the neighbors that I talked about, this was one of their bikes. So I ended up actually buying it off of them. And as you can see here, this is when I first got some MX gear. And before I actually rode it on the tracks, I was riding around on a private property on a farm, and then eventually got to riding on some tracks. And this thing was just a bastard to kickstart. It was a big 4-stroke thumper. It didn't have any hot start, decompression lever or anything like that. So anytime that you dropped it on the trails, it was just so damn near impossible to get it started. But I managed, and I got quite a lot of rides in on different tracks, local tracks in the area. It was the first bike that I'd trailered to tracks, because in the past it was only just the private property, my family's home, and the paddocks right next to the house. But yeah, Harrison and I would try and get out as much as we could and really build up our off-road skills. Now, it was also around this time that we both kind of got the inkling to get road bikes, much to my parents' dismay. I was scouring the internet for a good deal because I was at uni at the time, and owning 2 bikes, it's pretty expensive. So I ended up finding a really good condition Kawasaki Ninja 250, and that was the first ever road bike that I purchased. His dad's obligatory test ride of the bike. As much as he hated the idea of riding a bike on the road, you can tell that he was eager to give it a shot, though I don't think wearing the no gear was a good idea. So I actually loved riding this Ninja. I'd ride it every moment that I could. I loved the fact that I didn't have to trailer the bike like I did with my KLX. I could just get on, ride when I wanted, and have some fun on it. But over time, riding it on the road did get quite boring. I outgrew it pretty quickly, mostly the power. It felt less powerful than my KLX, which I would have much preferred to have on the road just for the fun factor. But yeah, over time, just got bored of it. I was restricted for 3 years because of the license system here in Victoria. So I could get something a little bit more powerful, but not a proper bike like a CBR 600. It could be like a Ninja 600 or something like that at the time. But it just wasn't worth upgrading for the cost. Like I mentioned, I already had the KLX, so I couldn't really get another expensive bike. So yeah, I kind of got bored. And after some time, I felt like it was time to upgrade the KLX. Not because the bike wasn't capable, but it was quite old. It was actually a 1998 model. I wanted to tackle more challenging terrain without worrying about not being able to start the bike or struggling to start it when it was a hot start. So out with the KLX and in with the CRF 250X. This was my first road bike that had electric start, and this was the first seriously powerful bike that I'd owned. Even though it was a 250 and I had less engine capacity than the KLX, this was a full-blown enduro bike versus the KLX, which was a trail bike. So in first, second, or even third, if you crack that throttle, it would power wheelie, which was the first time any of my bikes had done that, and it was just crazy. It was such an intoxicating feeling. I can't really find any footage of me riding on it. I did strap a GoPro at different times on some of the rides. Here's just me ripping up my parents' grass, and here's another one of Dad's obligatory test rides where he does drop the bike. So at this time, I owned the Ninja 250 and the CRF 250X, and I was deep into watching moto vlogs on YouTube. And at the time, the Honda Grom had come out and it was blowing up. All the content creators, all the YouTubers were posting videos on it, and I got hooked on the idea of owning one. So what did I do? I went and bought a brand new Honda Grom. And the only reason I could do it was because I got some scholarship funding from uni, and that just went straight to buying the Honda Grom. So the reason I bought it was because I was still on my restrictions, and I thought, you know what, I'd get something like this because I can have some fun, and then later on down the track, get something like a GSXR. And here's me actually sitting on one in the store, and who knew that further down the line, I would own one, and we'll talk about that later. But back to the Grom, I just wanted to have some fun on this, and maybe I ended up having a little too much fun. Got into a little bit of trouble with the law, nothing serious, but I learnt my lesson, and I didn't really own the Grom for very long. After that whole debacle happened, ended up getting rid of the Grom. So then I was just the CRF 250X and the Ninja 250. Again, I was back at those two bikes. So some time had passed, and like I mentioned, I was kind of bored of riding the Ninja and the hassle of riding the CRF 250X, where I had to trailer the bikes, and I didn't actually own a car that could trailer the bike, so I'd be dependent on friends riding and taking me. I wasn't getting much use out of that either. And that's where the idea of a dual sport came into my head. So then in comes my first dual sport, and this really changed everything. It allowed me to do the two things that I enjoy, which was riding on the road and riding off-road, but it eliminated the issue of having to have a trailer to trailer the bike, and it wasn't boring like the Ninja 250, because anytime that I came across a dirt track or something, which is very plentiful here in Victoria, I could just bomb down that track and have a look at what was happening. So the dual sport that I got was the Honda CRF 250L, and both my brother and I purchased these new. That's him at the dealership on the bike. And yeah, this opened up a whole new world of adventure for us because now we were able to camp off the back of the bikes. Not that we couldn't do that on the road bike, but it's just not made for it. So we slowly started modifying the bikes, getting luggage, and started heading out for our first moto camping adventures. Nothing crazy though, no Simpson Desert crossings or anything like that. But yeah, overnighters at the local trails, and we'd tackle some of the more challenging terrain on these bikes. But again, nothing crazy, no Billy Goat's Bluff. And I loved the CRF 250L. It was a good looking bike, super fun, did everything I wanted. But in my heart, I knew that I would have preferred the WR 250R. At the time, they were just too expensive, but I really wanted that off-road capability. Ended up settling for the CRF 250L because I got a really good deal on it. Brand new 6.3K Australian dollars. Like the amount of bike that you're getting, like this bike can do everything that the WR does. The WR just does it a little bit better. And I know that because later on down the track, I do end up getting one, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. But yeah, my brother and I would ride the crap out of these CRFs. Unfortunately then, lockdowns happened. And this just meant that the bikes would lay dormant and I didn't get any opportunity to ride. So at this time, we were in and out of lockdowns. I'd actually sold the Ninja at this point because I was just riding the CRF so much more. And I'd actually come off of my restrictions. The 3 years had passed. So I was itching to get my first full power road bike. And I wanted something that wouldn't kill me like a 1000cc super bike, but I'd also test ridden a 600cc, it was a CBR 600, and I wasn't too happy with the lack of torque. And personally, I find the torque the most fun on the road because you can, blast up legally to the speed limit, whereas on a 600, you got to be ripping on it way past the speed limit to experience the power band. So in comes the Honda Hornet CB919, bit of a mouthful. And this bike was a monster. Couldn't believe that I was allowed to ride this thing on the road because of just how much power it would have. It really had that rip your arm off power, and it just wanted a wheelie anytime that you got on it, and didn't have any traction control, no ABS, so it was all down to you to be responsible and not get yourself in trouble or hurt. And it was actually the first bike that I'd taken my fiance on the back of, who's now my wife. And yeah, she loved it. We had a good time riding that bike. But like before, we were kind of in and out of lockdowns at this time. And I rode the bike when I could. But over time, I still found myself going back to riding the CRF 250L. Even if it was an intended road ride, I'd still get on the CRF because it was more comfortable. And like I said, if I had the opportunity, I saw a dirt track, I'd go down it and I'd just have so much more fun than when I was on the Hornet. So after only 8 months, I sold the Hornet. And here's the guy who purchased it riding off into the wind. And not long after that though, I actually sold the CRF 250L. And here's also a video of the guy who purchased it, but this time he picked it up with a trailer and took it off my hands. But why did I sell the CRF? I had no bikes, I was bikeless. It was a foreign feeling because for the longest time I'd always had a motorcycle in the garage that I could just ride when I wanted. But there was a reason why I sold the Honda, and it was at this time that the Yamaha Tenere 700 had come out. And I was drooling. All the videos were coming out. It just looked awesome. Had the road performance, had the off-road performance. I thought, wow, this could be the do-it-all, jack-of-all-trades bike that I really wanted. So lo and behold, Harrison and I both purchased brand new Yamaha Tenere 700s. Straight off the showroom floor, such a good feeling picking up the bike. And At this time, I'd uploaded a couple of videos of prior rides on the older bikes, I think 2 or 3 on the channel. But once I started uploading Tenere 700 content, I started getting a whole bunch of subscribers because I got it pretty early on and there weren't many other people making videos of the T7 and it was quite new. So that just drew an audience that came to the channel. And that really kickstarted AusMoto, was purchasing the T7. So with the T7, I took that on quite a few adventures and I'd really start challenging myself with the terrain I was tackling. Even though it was a big bike, it was capable. Hard work, but I'd have so much fun trying to push the big bike through the tough stuff. But every time I dropped the bike, I did feel bad because you just damage more when you dropped it as opposed to the trail and enduro bikes. So what did I do to fix that issue? I went and bought another bike to complement the T7 and to further build my off-road skills. And in comes the mighty KTM 450. It was my first European bike that I'd ever owned. Now, I thought the CRF 250X was powerful and a wheelie machine. This was on another level. This would power wheelie first, second, third, fourth, and fifth gear if you crack the throttle hard enough. Now, part of that was because of the gearing. The owner had a massive rear sprocket on it, but my God, this bike was insane. And it was the bike that really did build up my off-road skills because Harrison and I were pretty much riding on, heading out on enduro rides every weekend that we could. And it was almost every other week, and we'd be tackling tough single tracks, pushing ourselves. And if you're interested in that, there's actually a lot of older videos on the channel of us tackling those tougher single tracks. So I do enjoy going back and watching those videos because it was the last enduro bike that I would own. Doesn't mean there's not one coming in the future though, especially with my track record as you've seen. But we continue. So the T7 was giving me more than enough road performance and gave me the ability to do adventures. And the KTM was the bike where I could push myself off-road, build up the skills, and it was a great combo of bikes to have at that time. But then long-time subscribers of the channel would know I went and tore my pec tendon, ripped it completely off the humerus bone. Wasn't a motorcycle related injury or accident, but that meant 6 months of recovery, no riding, and up to a year of rehab. So given that I couldn't ride, and even when I could get back to riding, I wasn't meant to do anything hardcore, which meant no real proper off-roading, I decided to sell both the T7 and the KTM 450, and they pretty much sold within 3 weeks of each other. And I was bikeless again. So this period of time was a rough time as I was dealing with recovering from a major injury. I was in the process of also purchasing my first home and moving, and that wasn't easy because I was in a sling and having to try and move with one arm was not a good situation. But there was a light at the end of the tunnel, and I knew that I would be back on a bike in the near future. And soon enough, I had the right idea of getting a bike that not many people in their 20s would consider getting, and that was my Suzuki V-Strom 1000. I couldn't even ride the bike home as I'd just gotten out of the sling and my arm had turned into the size of a broomstick from the lack of use. So I'd just gotten my dad to pick up the bike for me. And it was purchased off a 70-year-old bloke who had meticulously maintained it. He put on all the mods that I needed, which included the luggage, and that was perfect because the reason that I bought this bike was to have some fun on the road because it still had 100 horsepower or over 100 horsepower, which is plenty for the road, but it gave me the ability that when I felt up to it to go off-road, but just, gravel roads, nothing technical like I did in the past. But just knowing that I could do that when I was up to it was just the best thing in the world. And this bike, really could do it, do everything that I wanted while I was in this state that not tackling challenging terrain. I also purchased it because I wanted a bike that I could comfortably ride to up with the wife because, as I mentioned, she enjoyed riding the Hornet, but that wasn't comfortable. This V-Strom was on a whole nother level. It was like a sofa chair that you're riding on. She loved it. It was comfortable for her. And with this bike, we ended up doing a 8 day, or was it 9 days? Or 8 or 9 days, 3,000 kilometer adventure into the Flinders Ranges on this bike. So I really got some good use out of it. But by the time I got back, I was obsessed with the idea of getting a dual sport. So whilst I was actually on the Flinders trip, an ad came up for a WR250R. It was in absolutely mint condition. And like I mentioned earlier, the WR250R was always the bike that I wanted to get. So yeah, before I even got home, I'd messaged the guy, organized to go see it and pick it up. And it wasn't too long before the WR250R was in my garage. To this date, the WR is the bike that I've ridden the most, modified the most, and had the most fun on. It's taken me on so many adventures. It's never even let me down. I've actually got a project in play, which I'll talk about in another video, but that's Project 100K, which is to reach 100,000 kilometers on the WR250R. Hopefully I can reach it without having to do the piston or rings. That'd be awesome, so fingers crossed. But yeah, the WR has been everything that I wanted it to be. I've modified it to meet my needs. The only thing that it's lacking is power, and power is fun on the road. Off-road you don't need as much, but on the road you really do want some power. And because of that lack of power, in comes the next bike, and the last bike that I've purchased it won't be the last that I've ever purchased, but it is the most recent purchase, and that is the Suzuki GSXR 1000. Remember the photo of me earlier on the GSXR wishing I could, at the time I wish I could even ride one, let alone own one, but now it's in my possession, and my God, I don't understand how this thing is legal on the road. Like, it can do 160 kilometers per hour in first gear. It's got a top speed of 300. I just can't explain. If you haven't ridden one of these bikes, you can't put it into words. Like, you have to ride it to experience just how mental these things are. And it wasn't long until I realized that if I wanted to keep my license and probably my life, that I needed to take this to the track where it belongs. So first thing I actually did was take it to the drag strips, and never done that before, had no idea what I was doing. I wasn't dropping the clutch because I was too much of a wuss. Ended up running a 10.2. That's faster than most cars. The supercars aren't doing that. And I had no idea what I'm doing. With a little bit of practice and maybe some slight modifications, I could easily run in the 9s, which is mind-boggling. And then shortly after that, I took it to Phillip Island, where I could really stretch its legs and use it for its intended purposes, which is riding around a racetrack. And that pretty much brings us to the present day, where I have the GSXR 1000 and the WR250R. Both these bikes allow me to do the full spectrum of riding. So I can do full-blown enduro days, all the way to track days and everything in between. So I hope you guys enjoyed this trip down memory lane. I know I sure did. And if you want to continue to see how this story unfolds, please do subscribe to the channel. Big things coming up for 2024. And I'll see you guys in the next one.